webinar is make this available. Perfect, make this available. And let's go ahead and start this webinar. Lisa, I will let you open us up.
Great. Well, I'm very excited to be with you today. I will be the moderator for today's webinar, and I'm sure that we're going to get a lot of questions. It's a really timely topic. It's a very hot topic. So we want to make sure that the 45 minutes you and Wes have allocated is chock full of information and allows the attendees to take away as much information as possible. That being said, as I said, I'm sure we're going to have some questions. So to help the webinar move along and stay on our time, there's two ways that we're going to allow webinar attendees to ask these questions. First of all, if you have a question that is timely or specific to one of the topics that Phil or Wes is discussing at the moment, you can raise your hand. I will talk to you in the chat and ask you to type in your question, or you can simply type your question into the Q&A box and you'll see both options at the bottom of your menu bar. And what we'd like to do is try to answer those questions at the end. We're going to hold back about 15 minutes or more to answer questions so that everybody can have an opportunity to ask a question if they have one. If we do run up against time or you're not able to stay past an hour, if you do type your questions into the Q&A box and they don't get answered, this will allow us to make sure that we get to answer it via email or phone call later, because we want to make sure that you get all the information that you need today. The second is we are recording this webinar, so if you'd like a copy of it, again, if you have to leave for time reasons, we can email you that or we'll put it up in our YouTube channel. And finally, after the webinar, there's a very short anonymous survey that's going to pop up. I would really encourage every attendee today just to take a moment, answer those questions, because our goal is to really provide you with the most useful, valuable information possible. And by answering these questions, we're going to make sure that each webinar meets that goal, if not exceeds it. So that's my role. Without further ado, I'm going to turn off my video and allow the two masters to start the show.
Perfect. Thank you, Lisa.
Welcome.
So jumping into this, just I want to thank you all. So good morning, good afternoon, and thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us. My name is Phil Ben-Joseph. I am CIO over at Profit Enhancement Systems. Prior to coming to Profit Enhancement Systems, I have ran enterprise infrastructure and DevOps for a number of years for some large global organizations. And during that time, I've seen a lot in terms of infrastructure and what people have done and how people have run things, or how I've run things. At my past organization, probably about 5-6 years ago, I had brought Profit Enhancement Systems into my organization to really help me out from a telecom expense management perspective and wireless expense management, get a handle on my inventory expenses, where a lot of my large spend was going, because at that time, that was what the majority of the spend for the organization was really headed, was dealing with the carrier, the data centers, whether it was voice, data communications, infrastructure. And PES really helped get a handle on that environment and drive down my costs pretty significantly, about 30-40% annually. And during that time, built a great relationship with the team, and ended up joining on a couple years ago, back in 2019. And during that time, I basically developed our cloud advisory services. And it's been pretty exciting to see our cloud practice grow. And today I'm on the phone with Wes North, who I'd like to introduce, who's a principal over at NorthernTec. So Wes, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thanks, Phil, and thanks everyone for joining. My name is Wes North. I am the principal at NorthernTec Cloud Consulting. I have, as well as Phil, quite a rich and maybe somewhat complicated background when it comes to the tech and cloud space. For the past, I would actually say a decade now, my focus, or as I like to call it, my master thesis, has been figuring out how companies move successfully and effectively from on-prem systems into cloud environments, whether they start natively or they do a migration. There's all sorts of cultural and technical implications. You know, you can sort of look at the people, process, technology spectrum, and there's ripe opportunities across the board. I've been very fortunate in my career to work with quite an amazing cast of support and peers and colleagues. And obviously, Phil and I go way back. He was my former CIO at another life and another company. And I think this topic in terms of transparency and cost, as well as culture and the things that companies go through when they take on this journey, is very applicable and apropos for the times that we're in. So I'm very pleased to be here, and thank you for everyone joining.
Great, thanks, Wes. So the way I wanted to form this was really this is just a conversation as a whole. So we won't be reading from the slower PowerPoints. They're more as a guide. But one thing that I think that we've all seen is the evolution of the cloud. And one of the things that we've done from a company perspective is finding a place to where we partner with our clients during their cloud journey and through their cloud journey. And what's interesting is, and Wes, I wanted to get your take on this one, was, as companies look to progress into the cloud, they typically start small. They typically dip their toes. Let me put a little dev out there. Let me put a little test environment out there. And all of a sudden, before long, you've got environments growth where now you have 1%, 3%, 5%, 20% of your environment now is in the cloud. And all of a sudden, before you know it, a large amount of your spend on a monthly recurring basis is out there, and people are just getting surprised about that. And so what we've seen is as companies grow, it's that surprise at how much cloud spend they really have and where their cloud journey is really going.
Yeah, Phil, I think it's a very interesting situation when you're looking at how you start out. And I think there's different approaches, obviously, through an evolution. Some companies that they're brand new, their first thought is, I need to leverage technology that's in the cloud. So it's sort of a no-brainer. I think for the companies that have been around for a long time, that have brick and mortar products, or even those that have traditionally focused on on-prem spend, or even some sort of co-location situation, each of them has sort of a subtle nuance in my experience. And to your point, usually what happens is someone comes up with an idea, and the impetus is multiple, right?
Right.
I can't get stuff provisioned fast enough. I'm blocked by X, Y, and Z, team or department. And it's affecting productivity. Engineering productivity is probably the biggest sort of detractor, to getting products out there and to realizing revenue targets and everything else. Because if someone needs to put something into production, want to promote some code or X, Y, and Z, it's going to require me at least 15 different steps that I'm not aware of. And so when you look at sort of the cloud environment, the general sort of concept that I've heard over and over again is that it's easier to start there, or it's easier to start building net new products into the cloud. Mm-hmm. And because then I can free up my developer productivity, and I'm not constrained, right? Constraints, if we're not careful, can really upset the natural sort of progressive sequence in moving businesses forward, or whatever the particular goal or objective is. And in the last several years of my career have been spent with companies that have on-prem products that need to move into the cloud. And what I have seen is exactly what you said. We start with maybe one or two small products, maybe some cloud infrastructure, and then we start moving it forward. The ones that are most successful, in my personal opinion and experience, are those that have sort of looked at everything that they're doing. So I want to put this product into the cloud. What are the steps that it has to take? What are the constraints, operational constraints, security constraints, et cetera? And then, we make that forward progress. But if we're not thinking long-term, you're absolutely correct. You wake up one morning and you realize your cloud expenses are exceeding either your budget, or to some extent, if you're looking out for anomalies, it can actually get even more disastrous. And there's all sorts of horror stories of people waking up to hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of invoices that they have to go back to the public cloud providers and debate. So every company is going to be slightly, absolutely. Every company is going to be different, a little bit different, but I think there's a common theme. Try before you buy, test it out, and then look at the maturity curve.
Yep. And I think that try before you buy is pretty interesting, because that right there is, what am I doing? What do I want to do?
Yeah,
what are my business objectives? And so what happens is, as people are going through their cloud journey, It's like you said, like we talked about, you start small, but how do you really realize the value of the cloud? And I think that's really the biggest thing right there is, and we've all hit this. You get the CIOs talking to their team saying, hey guys, we are going to save so much money by getting out of these data centers. We've got to go to the cloud. But is it really about cost, or is it about, hey, how are you driving? And I wanted to hit this one specifically with you because there are KPIs that are used to really say, how valuable is the cloud to our product offering? Not just how am I driving the lift and shift of the environment into the cloud, but how am I getting the most out of that cloud environment to really drive that digital transformation? And digital transformation is not lift and shift and putting it in a new location. It's, and everybody does or defines digital transformation a little differently. But how do you define digital transformation, and how have you used KPIs in your past to really drive that, cloud center of excellence for really driving that value and understanding value?
Yeah, I think the business objectives have to be defined up front. I mean, there's no question in my mind. I mean, we can say that I want more flexibility, I want more productivity, but that's sort of a nice mission statement. Well, let's unpack that, go a little deeper, see what those key performance indicators are that you need to measure. For us in my career in the past, like again, several years, usually what we find is the developer productivity again is usually the constraint. It can't get things done fast enough. There's too many barriers to entry. Okay, got that. Then there's another one, which is like, we think we're going to be better off if we get into the cloud. So if we just take that sort of, I will say this, it's not really naive, but it's maybe not as well thought out of a mission statement to just say, I want to get there, because you might end up finding that it costs you more. It's far less secure. It's almost like the quintessential statement. If you're going to go to war, you want to consider your costs beforehand, right? Do I have the right resources? Do I have enough food for my team, right? So that they don't die on the battlefield. Well, I kind of see the cloud and tech migration strategies as a very similar concept. Consider your costs up front. Otherwise, your lift and shift approach, or lift, shift, and tinker, or refactor and then shift, or build net new. And there's about 15 different ways you can go about this.
Right.
To me, it kind of turns into lipstick on a pig. At the end of the day, I've got this really monolith application that, I think could be better served here. It's much more flexible and I can contain my costs. This is another thing. And you hit it here with center of excellence, right? If you've got one team driving this and you don't have the buy-in of everyone else, then that team's objective is to get to where they need to get without any other input. And they're marching along happily thinking that they're making progress. And then you wake up 6 months or a year later and someone says, well, your Gen 1 architecture doesn't fit my needs. And so now I want to assign this team to revamp it. So then you go from Gen 1 to Gen 1.5 to Gen 2 to Gen 3. The point being is that the carrot's always dangling in front of you. It's always moving. The target's always moving. Your question has to become, what are those key performance indicators? What are my margins? What am I trying to hit? Am I reducing my operational expense? Am I trying to contain capital expense management in favor of operational expenses? Am I trying to free up my team for productivity? Am I trying to reduce the amount of resources that I need to manage my products, which then infers something else, which is really cloud automation and all of that wraps into it. So there's so many considerations, but I think it has to start with a meeting of the minds. You need your IT ops, your dev, your engineers, your finance teams. You need your security organization 100% to buy in. And then you need executive sponsorship where everyone's skin is in the game, right? So that we're all sort of like responsible for this process and where we need to get. And then you just set your goals, you manage it one by one.
And I think you hit the nail on the head right there. Is if you don't, and we call it stewardship, cloud center of excellence, but ultimately
cloud governance,
it's a group of people, cloud governance, there's a lot of names around it and people get lost in the names, but ultimately it's who's the group responsible for overall cloud, the cloud environment, whether it's expenses, architecture, business justification, whatever the case may be, but it's getting the team together on a regular basis to really understand what your exposure is and have that open dialogue as to what you're doing.
Right. And
because that's the part that really,
no, Phil, you're right. I was going to say the central approach, right? What is traditionally considered the traditional centralized command and control structure that was IT operations or IT technology management or whatever you want to call it, that naturally has to evolve as well. One of the other aspects of my sort of master thesis in life is how to move from a centralized product ownership structure to decentralized. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you should increase all your costs exponentially or that you need twice as many people. I think there's a fallacy within that assumption that, you know, I can decentralize safely if you don't plan it, because then what you have is maybe you have 5 to 10 different products and you've got 5 to different teams working in 5 to 10 different directions and 5 to 10 different objectives. You know, There's not really a central sort of theme of here's what I want to do. Here's goal 1. You know, I always like to say, let's make the first mission statement. I don't want to ruin my company by making ill-informed budgetary decisions and executing in the cloud and then creating, you know, a massive fallout. So let's not ruin the company. And by the way, the company is the people. So let's not really make each other mad and upset about this, because it's gonna bring up a lot of emotions, a lot of defensiveness about like what we've done in the past and where we need to go into the future. And I remember some of these conversations, Phil, and I'll stop here. I remember conversations where I would have development organizations and engineers talking to me as I was running DevOps and SecOps and Tech Ops and all of these different ops. And I would make a comment, well, you've missed this. And they're like, oh, Wes, but you're being argumentative. And I'm like, well, no, I'm not being argumentative. I'm actually providing an educational service so that we demystify what's been happening on-prem. All of the underlying infrastructure from Active Directory to Linux AMIs or on-prem systems to Windows to firewalls and storage and, you know, your CI/CD pipelines, you know, do you use Jenkins and all of these different things? You know, you have to sort of look at each of those and say, how's it going to get you there? You know, how's it going to get me there?
I think one of the key things, you mentioned right there in terms of this practice for bringing everybody together is understanding conflict. And there is and I know we're going philosophical, you know, but there's a difference between healthy conflict and unhealthy conflict. You know, when I was running operations with the team, and even today when I'm working with different IT organizations across the board on their spend management, it really is, you need to have conflict because they have their opinion, you have your opinion. You have your way of doing things, they have their way of doing things. So you have to have a healthy debate back and forth and understand that these aren't personal attacks, but they're healthy debates back and forth on the right approach. Don't take it personal. You know, it's a healthy debate back and forth, and go to lunch afterwards or have a virtual,
absolutely.
You know,
have a beer, ask the questions, like you said, understand the direction, understand how the decisions are being made, right? Like we say in the organization, if there is clarity, oh my goodness, it opens up such a more rich dialogue. Absolutely.
It's all about communication. All about communication and that's the reason for this, but it's all about communication and transparency. The more people know, the less people argue. Don't hide the stuff.
We can almost stop the webinar at that point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, you know, we talk about cloud governance framework, and by no means am I going to be reading every one of these bullet line items, but we've hit the topic time and time again. You know, a lot of organizations, everybody treats finance a little differently. Everybody treats money a little differently, whether you're private equity, public company, private company, whether you deal with CapEx, OpEx. So what I want to focus more on is the traditional way of budgeting your spend in a CapEx environment, really a centralized environment for what's on-prem. And when we did that on-prem, and I worked with the team, it was basically, I had to work with finance, procurement, you know, sourcing. I had everybody in a room and basically call it Q3, Q4 the prior year. I was budgeting for my environment for the next year, if you will. And I would always have to pad my infrastructure. Now, I never told them this, but I was always padding my infrastructure by call it 25% because I needed to manage for growth. Because I didn't have an opportunity really to, you know, reevaluate that in the middle of the year. I need to basically build my environment up so that I was sitting at about, you know, 30% utilization so that I could grow 30, 40% that year and stay below, call it that 70%, 80% mark where things get in trouble if you start hitting that threshold from on-prem. So you're always over provisioning on-prem.
Right.
Well, the cloud now changes that. Now, all of a sudden you're going to a model where, you know what? I don't want to over provision. I don't want to treat the cloud like a traditional data center. Otherwise, you're going to spend significantly more than you need to. So it's just in time provisioning. So how have you handled that transition in communication and budgeting in your career from what was traditional on-prem to now that variable OpEx? And going back to that KPI discussion we had earlier of
Right.
tying that back to business values and justification.
Well, I would say the first thing that comes to mind is it goes right back to your comment about slush funds, right? Your buffer for budgeting tolerance. So I found out from a really good CFO that was at my previous employer that at the end of the day, everyone has a buffer in their budget. And his goal was to figure out how much of my buffer could be removed to meet his objective. I've always known that CFOs have their own slush fund, and I've always known that the CEO, depending on the organization, founders of organizations tend to have much more sway, I think, based on experience. But similar story. Every year in October, I would bring the team together, multiple people in the team. Procurement was in there as well. And we'd spend, I think the first year when I was at my previous employer full-time, it took us probably about 3 to 4 weeks to get through the budgeting cycle before we could present the artifact to the FP&A team. So the finance.
So that was just the draft. That was just the development of the draft.
That was just the
3 to 4
development
weeks
of the draft.
development of the draft.
Right. Mm-hmm. And then it was another 2 to 3, maybe 2 months, right? So if we started in October, by December, right? And the goal was always by Q4, when we're doing a Q4 earnings statement or we're closing the books by Q4, we need to have insight in what the budget is going to be for the following year.
Right.
Because if you're a publicly traded company, you want to forecast that, as effectively as possible, which I think that in and of itself, being sort of measured on whether or not you hit that, obviously it's a KPI that you cannot ignore. But to say that that this budget represents reality is sort of a fallacy as well, And so that's why we budget. Right. That's why we say, okay, even after the first year that we did the budgeting on CapEx, and then 3 years later went from a 3-month to a 3-week process, you still came out with the same thing. I would take last year's budget. I would go to my FP&A guy and I would say, or person, woman, man, doesn't matter. But we would actually say, hey, what do I need to hit for my budget allocation? And then I would get that number. Sometimes it's 10% over the prior year. Sometimes it was a cost reduction.
Yeah.
And then I'd back into that. And in the cloud, this is the other thing. So in the cloud, it became exponentially harder because now you have much more buy-in. And I will say this, if we haven't educated people in proper finance management, to me, it's almost like if you run your household budget successfully, you could probably do a good job with the business, right? Because if you're really being cautious about your spend, you're going to look at the business spend as your own, which is always the case that we should be looking at that. But long story short, I think when we moved into the cloud, it became harder for us to get teams to understand first. So we had to educate them. And then after that, they would all come back with the same question that we had. Well, how am I supposed to know what's going to happen 3 months from now when the product development cycle is not necessarily aligned with the annual budgeting cycle? Aha, there, to me, is a ripe opportunity. Whereas what we did and was successful is we created that cloud governance team. We hired cloud economists that understood how to really analyze the public cloud data. And then we formed a guild or a center of excellence like we've talked about. And we brought everybody in and we said, okay, every month we're doing a budgetary review. Your product is generating this much operational expense. You budgeted X percentage. You're over, you're under. What are you going to do? By the way, here's X, Y, and Z anomalies. So you have that monthly cadence. Then you should have like a quarterly cadence with your C-level teams, because that's usually when public companies they announce their earnings quarterly. A lot of companies will look at quarterly, sort of revenue statistics and all of that to sort of drive their decisions. And then last thing I'll say is we always have a buffer. There is the unknown unknowns. And so a lot of times what I would do, because I started getting frustrated because I'd put in there, I'd say, okay, the unknowns, right? 10%, well, just lop that off. Okay, then in 3 months from now, I'm going to be outside of my budget again. So then you get creative and you start to talk to people and you say, okay, well, I'm actually going to have this under this line item. But that sort of subterfuge doesn't last very long, because at the heart of it, Phil, and I think you and I both are, really driving at this, is that if you don't trust the people that are there to help you make the right decisions, then you're forever going to be caught in this mode of like, cut your budget, whatever, right? We're going to be arguing about this stuff incessantly versus saying, well, what can we do to make sure that we're all aligned? And I would say clarity and alignment, generally speaking, are the two things that tend to hit organizations the hardest.
Yep. And it's like anything else, it's an ongoing conversation. When you talk governance,
Right.
It's not a one-time event. And this is every organization, it's not a one-time event. When you come in there, you talk about cloud spend, you talk about how you're doing allocation of spends, how you're doing forecasting and budgeting and reforecasting. It really is, it's an ongoing discussion, like you're saying. It's how do you measure it? You can't manage what you can't measure. So, great man once said that.
Well, and also the other thing I was going to say, Phil, too, is that I think when you're looking at moving to a cloud sort of operational model, you naturally start to look at your capital expenditures, like how you depreciate all of that, right? And then you're flipping it into an OpEx model. So by that very nature of that decision, it infers that you must have accounting buy-in. You must have the finance teams buy-in. The CFO and the CTO and the CIO have to see eye to eye. I mean, within reason. They don't have to agree, but they can agree on the core objective.
So I think I want to hit on something else you just said. We talked about this in terms of the governance model of bringing the teams together and talking about their spend as a whole.
Right.
So a lot of that I consider not only transparency, but accountability. So when you have the different project teams, and it could be project teams, it can be cost centers, it could be product teams, whatever the case may be. But ultimately, how do you align, and I call it, the famous words of charge back, show back, or shame back reporting.
Shame back.
I like the word shame back reporting.
I do. It's really fun. By the way, it's effective. It's like negative reinforcement. It's like it does produce positive results.
You know what? It's one of the things that I found over the course of my career, it's the more transparency you have, the better your relationship is with the different departments. And I'll give this great example is my last organization. I became great friends with the sourcing guy, because that's the way you get the job done is through partnerships in the organization and not remaining in a silo within your group. It's you've got, when going back to the CapEx versus OpEx, you were forced to work together during that particular period of time. As now you spend, you can get in trouble very quickly if you don't have those good relationships and develop and foster a program.
My goodness, Phil, I think that's a really good point about the again, trust within your peers, right? I mean,
that's it.
If I would say one of the things that I just to back you up on this, I would often call the director of FP&A personally and say, okay, here's where we're at. What do you think? And I would get his opinion on whether or not the CFO was in an amenable state to appreciate what we're pitching. And then the second thing is whether or not it met the overall objectives. And that helps 100%. It's almost like you do all of the work behind the scenes. And then when you come up to the C levels, you're like, here's what we all have agreed to. Here's based on your input, and here's the plan. And then you go from there.
Yep. So on the accountability front, one of the things that hits me time and time again is it's IT that's budgeting. It's IT that's driving the costs. It's IT this, IT that. But how have you worked in your past organizations and how are you working now to really understand that IT is one driver of costs, but ultimately you've got two levers that are going back and forth. IT controls a portion of the cost in terms of maybe how efficiently or inefficiently technology is deployed, but in terms of how much technology is needed is really driven by the business and the organization. Because they may have a new initiative, a new client comes on board. Well, guess what? Your costs are obviously going up because you got a new client on board. Maybe you have to throw a new environment because you're not dealing with a multi-tenancy application. You have to throw a new environment up there. So how are you tracking that? So how have you driven or managed accountability within the organization in the past?
Yeah, it's not been easy. I would say the most recent example, we remember it probably took us about 2 years to get to a point where we had a mature operating model dealing with cost management. And it goes back to that center of excellence. It goes back to, we hired cloud economists, people that are educated in public cloud services that know more details about the services. And these are people, I'm really impressed by the way that these people work, because they can go in and look at any number of services within like Amazon or Azure or GCP, and they can come back and say, hey, I realize you made X decision, but there's another way to do this, So having cloud economists on your organization as part of the center of excellence is really vitally important. I think at the end of the day, what we found was when we got the decision makers within the engineering organization, right? And there's multiple of those. The security organization, because they're driving requirements based on policies that are governed by regulatory institutions and everything else.
Right.
Then you have your IT team that traditionally manages the central budget. The central budget still gets managed by a central team. So whether you call it IT ops, or whether you call it cloud ops, or whether you call it cloud engineering, whatever it is, there always has to be a single entity that is responsible for generating the metrics that you're measuring your success against. And then from there, you have everyone that's held accountable. And this gets deeper, Phil, and we're not gonna have time for this, but really moving from centralized product management to decentralized product management has been a key thing within my mind, right? Because years ago, you would try and decentralize IT and you tripled your costs, or in some cases, you and I have been there, where you see the cost skyrocket. You're like, why did I go from 500 servers to 5,000 in 2 years? That doesn't make any sense. But because no one's really checking the budget, no one's really bringing everyone together. So you definitely have to have buy-in. You have to have the right people in the positions to make those decisions. And then you need to have accountability driven by how you are going to enforce compliance. And it's got to be sort of the mix of positive and negative reinforcement, right? Positively speaking, we don't want the company to be ruined. Negatively speaking, if we don't hit our goals, you don't get whatever budget or variable pay or whatever else it is that we're all tied to, right? Because at the end of the day, we're responsible for this. It's taking the responsibility from one organization and then saying, we're all part of the family and you all need to own this. And then we all operate together. You still have that central team. You still have them, and they're still sort of the godfather, right? They're still like, hey, how do you do this? What are your thoughts on this? But I am no longer the decision maker. I am the facilitator of the decision making. That's my thought.
Yeah, I think people, it's funny, you and I've worked together a lot in the past, and I think the biggest thing is to understand that everyone in the organization has a fiduciary responsibility to basically drive cost and operational efficiencies, and to know that they're better off partnering together to drive this solution forward. And when we talk about, and when we go into organizations, just from a PES perspective, when we go into organizations, one of the things that we first talk about is the need to come together. There's no silver bullet solution here. There's no silver bullet. Here's a product that's going to solve all your problems. It's putting together a practice. And
snake oil.
The more you can, exactly. Put the snake oil out there.
Right.
But basically there's no silver bullet solution out there. It's communication, it's collaboration. It's basically bringing the team together in a, roundtable discussion to really get a better understanding of what you're doing, how you're doing, and why you're doing.
Right. Yeah. And I think those genuine conversations go so much further than getting into a meeting and saying, you need to do this because of this, right? You attract more flies with honey than you do with vinegar, so to speak.
Amen to that. Amen to that. So as we kind of talk about this, I think, we chatted about, budgeting on a go forward basis. But as you get in there, I think what you'll find is, and what you found over years is your cloud spend is going up and down. And it may be new technologies you're putting in place, it may be new solutions you're testing out. But how have you gotten visibility, especially as you've driven a lot of this multi-cloud, managing multiple subscriptions, multiple accounts, projects, and everything like that, bringing everything in, getting visibility, and really kind of doing that budget management on an ongoing basis? How have those discussions gone, and how have you leveraged KPIs to really help you out?
Yeah, I think the key there goes back to what sort of telemetry Let me just put it to that way, because if I say tools, that really infers that, and this is, I think, the default mode of operation for most industries is just buy some tech and put it in there and let's get a report going. Well, sometimes you don't have the finances behind you to invest in any of these really great tools. And the maturity of these tools, by the way, these cloud expense management tools that are out there are fantastic compared to where they were years ago. I mean, when we started out, we would download the raw files and pop it into Excel and try and automate that as best as possible and show some trend lines. Now we have the ability within less than a 24-hour period to produce, not only granular level reporting, but product by product reporting assigned to product teams that are responsible for managing their budgets.
Right.
So visibility and being able to see that, I think is probably paramount. That's the first thing, right? We need to get people to see what the decisions that they're making, the implications or the ramifications of those actions. We need them to see those things so that then they're aware of it. And then they can start to make those educated decisions on how I want to address something one way or another. But again, I'm going to keep going back to, we have to have buy-in. We've got to have the proper team together that's not just made up of engineering and IT professionals or technology professionals now, right? Because the lines of dev and ops are so blurred. You might have a dev with a DevOps with a capital dev, and you might have a DevOps with a capital ops, Lucky is the organization that has both. Yep. And they're there, and it's a matter of time before you hit that. But I would always say it's a maturity curve sort of journey. You start off with just basic reporting, and then you move forward to more advanced, near real time if you can get to it. And then on top of that, I go back to monthly cadences, quarterly cadences. Then you do your budget, and then you reforecast it. At one point, we ended up reforecasting twice a year, because as the business starts to get much more flexible with the cloud technology and they're moving and grooving, you don't necessarily want to wait a month to look at your budget. You want to catch things further to the left, so to speak.
No, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. So as we drive into understanding, the budget, as we drive into really understanding the environment, I think one of the topics that, we work very closely with our clients on is not only driving, the visibility, accountability, but once you really drive accountability into who's doing what and where, it's really looking at the optimization opportunities. Right. And, so when you look at it, what does it mean to really take advantage of the cloud? And like we were talking about before, there's that traditional lift and shift. I want to get out of my data centers and I want to go to the cloud. So virtual machine to virtual machine, are you really getting anything out of that? How are you dealing with licensing? Because you have licensing implications, you have infrastructure implications. And then really, I saw a really good image of, all the different, all the way from, refactoring to retooling, to right. Basically, the lift and shift. And so as you look at optimization and right sizing the environment, what does that mean to you? Like, what is that? And I know that it means so much to so many different people. And what's interesting is you kind of have this concept of savings to level of effort is the way I've always looked at it.
Yeah.
Is, on the savings side of the house is you can save a pretty significant amount of money, but how much money is it going to really cost you? What's a level of effort from the team to really get that savings?
Yeah, the trade-offs is always a good discussion topic. I would say one thing that comes to mind is know thyself. Know what you don't know what you know, and then bring that openly to the organization. One of the challenges, especially in the SaaS space, the last 3 companies that I've worked with, all of them have suffered from the same ailment, which is, we want to build products to market quickly and effectively. We want to generate revenue. We want to meet our shareholder value and all of that. And so to some extent, we end up favoring getting products out there over doing it with a financial sort of constraint or security constraint or performance constraint. And it's always a degree of like, what sort of constraint do you want to put on, when you first get into the cloud? Let's just assume that you're there. Let's assume that you've done all that work and you have like your products in the cloud. You've gotten past maturity, step 0, and you're into step 1.5. At that point, the focus is gonna be, again, looking at the anomalies, looking at the reports, looking at my seasonal trends. I know for a fact that some companies, generate a lot more traffic the first quarter of the year, depending on if you're in the health and wellness space, for example, because guess what? Everybody's coming off of the holiday season and they don't want to be carrying that pound of Christmas cookie, So the health and wellness space, you would see an uptick in systems peak capacity and usage, which goes back to another comment you made on a previous slide. It's on-prem, you build to peak. In the cloud, you build for performance, security, agility, resiliency, and cost management, right? And you could probably distill it down into one or two of those bullet points, but you're still looking at peak, but you're doing it in a different way because you don't need to have your servers running at 50% capacity. I always like to say in the cloud space on-prem, right? If I'm in a SaaS company, keep all of my operational systems, databases, everything else at 50%, because if you have to handle a failover, you don't want to be running at 110% if you fail over. I think in the cloud, obviously it changes the whole paradigm because then we can automate, we can rapidly expand and grow within reason. I don't want to sell again snake oil or vaporware. Try spinning up a SQL server and then adding CPU to it or memory in a hot swap capacity in an automated fashion, and talk to some of the guys that have done that. It's complicated, and it goes right back to your point.
Level of effort.
What's the trade-off? What's the trade-off?
That's exactly it. And I think you hit the nail on the head. Yeah, but in terms of that, there are certain things, it's all in the design. And it really goes back to it goes back to DevOps. How close is the DevOps team really working together? And how can you really build a scalable model to really take advantage of the power of the cloud?
Yeah, DevOps too. And I would throw in one other one, Phil, site reliability, which is obviously a Google-esque sort of concept that arose many years ago. But I'm actually starting to see an interesting and good trend happening where you have DevOps that's now focused on the proper tools and methodologies, obviously, to get productive engineering to work and get your products out there. And they're handling all that cloud infrastructure, the pipelines, the statistical analysis of whether or not you're securely coding, all of that rich stuff that you have to do. But then you have a new organization that I think we used to call it the Network Operations Center back in the day, but now I'm a firm believer in site reliability, that these are the people that know the seasonal trends and they can tell you within a degree of certainty whether or not the plan's going to work. And I'll leave you this sort of example. My prior engagement, we were moving in a lift and shift fashion. It took us 3 years. And as I understand it, we're still moving forward, right? It doesn't, just because you got to the 3-year mark, everything's automated and you've done some work, it still means you got maybe 6 months to a year going forward to really realize the full dream. But at the end of the day, working within that organization, it was clear to me that as long as we established SLAs and organizational level agreements, and we took that DevOps and the site reliability team and we put them together and we said, we want to do this particular thing, which was shifting this very large customer into the cloud. And from a one perspective, it seems good on paper, it's going to hit my financial targets. But then on the other side, your site reliability engineers say, yeah, but there's a major flaw in that plan. The capacity of the on-prem system exceeds the capacity that's available in the cloud. So, that was 3 years ago. I mean, it's not necessarily the case as much today, but you would be surprised. Some organizations have these really massively non-optimized situations that, the level of effort to tune it would take them a year versus trying to get into the cloud, right? And putting it in there.
Yep.
So
couldn't agree more.
It's a trade-off.
Yep.
It's a trade-off. Each one has to make that decision.
Yep. Absolutely.
It's the voice from the cloud. You guys are doing great. And we do have some questions actually rolling in. So I know you're wrapping it up. I just want to give you a little bit of a time check so that you're going to be able to answer these questions.
Perfect. I'll just leave you guys at this is, as you go, kind of your cloud journey is, one of the things that we kind of looked at over time is how do you get to maturity? And maturity is defined, in each organization a little differently. And I think it's important to be honest about where you're at, take stock of, your team, your skill sets. And, you look at this. And when we kind of look at that crawl, walk, run mentality is crawl is, get the insights, eliminate the manual processes. We've talked to a number of clients out there that are, bringing all this information into Excel, developing pivot tables, and but they have no automated way to really kind of look at this information. But really gaining insights into what you have is really step one. and drive that accountability. And step two is really, how do you take that optimization to the next level and really take advantage of either reducing costs in terms of eliminating waste, consolidating spend, but more important, take advantage of those savings plans. And there are significant savings plans. And then run is really what we define as operational excellence, and that's defined differently for every organization, but it's coming up with a standard governance model where you have call it a cloud center of excellence, a team that is working with you hand in hand, where you have, call it daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly meetings to really review and a focus on spend. Because that's really the part that's missing, is in a lot of the conversations, everybody's focused on, development of new products, services, solutions, and that's all important from a business, keeping business up and running. Absolutely. But if you don't take the time and have those spend discussions and focus in those areas on a regular basis, you're kind of missing, missing the boat in terms of an opportunity to bring all the different groups together and get on the same page.
Yeah, the feedback loops, Phil, are the most important, right? Within all of those, right? If I can get feedback loops in terms of like, the financial implications, the decisions that we're making, or, we release something and we need people to understand what's happening, and bringing those metrics to the forefront on a regular basis, absolutely will get us there. One other thing I was going to say is, I look at the cloud as not necessarily more secure than our on-prem system. Left unchecked, you can do more damage than good. So having that forethought, like you said, start maybe a little slow, then ramp it up and be willing to take it back down again. You're going to find yourself sort of moving fast to pull back, maybe 2 steps forward, 1 step back, until you start to get that cadence into that maturity curve.
And this is a perfect example of fail quickly.
Yes.
And perfect example.
Fail safe. Nice.
So Lisa, let's open this up to questions. And Wes, thank you so much. So
thank you.
Let's open this up.
Great. No, thank you both. So you actually, both of you started to touch on this, and one of these questions just came in, and so I'm just going to start with this one because on the heels of that. And Phil, maybe it's a good one for you to lead off with, but one of the attendees would like to know, is there a quote unquote right time to look at cloud governance? They have a small spend right now, but they see it growing within the next 6 months.
Great question. I'm working with a client, actually former colleague, and they are 100% on-prem looking at cloud right now. And so their spend is, call it $1,000 a month, very small, if even that. And if you don't start your governance model early, you're throwing, just what Wes just said out, put out there, is it's a significant risk. You want to make sure you're deploying your foundation properly, you're tagging your foundation properly, you put a governance model in place in the beginning to really understand what that looks like, and then you build from there. And that 1% that's there, 2%, it's going to grow very rapidly as you build the skill set, the knowledge, and gain the comfort level of what's out there. It's going to grow, up and to the right and become a major cost line item within your P&L statement very quickly. And so what I would say is, when you start, get the experts in there, bring someone in. We're happy to consult with any of our partners. We have a CCMO practice, and so we're happy to consult and provide guidance. But the key there is do it the right way in the beginning, so you're not cleaning up in the end, because it's going to be a lot more cost effective doing it in the beginning. But more importantly, you're putting your organization at risk if you wait too long. I don't know, Wes, if you have anything else on that.
I think it's a perfect statement. There's no time like the present time to start. And I have this thing, the 7 deadly sins of the cloud, and one of those is not paying attention to your costs, and not having a proper governance model where you have people buying in. So yeah, I'm 100% on.
Great. Okay. John was curious about if you were going to get into any tools that you would recommend. Obviously, this webinar was not a demo for tools, but he was curious if you had any tools that you would recommend to help with this.
What I would say is, we have a practice around our cloud cost monitoring and optimization practice. And there are a plethora of tools out there. And, tools need to be specific to what you're doing. So there is no silver bullet tool that's going to solve all your problems. It's what are you trying to solve? And then we can work with you to understand. And we have a practice wrapped around a couple tools that we'd be happy to share with you. But like I said, it really depends on what you're doing, how you're doing, why you're doing. And then the tools would, be evaluated based on that.
Right, and I do believe that every attendee is going to get some downloads available to them afterwards as well. That'll sort of reinforce some of the points you both talked about today.
Yep, perfect.
Helpful. Wes, we just got a question in, and you had mentioned during the last slide cloud maturity. So this attendee would like to know, what does a company look like that has successfully managed a transition like that? So what does cloud maturity actually look like to you?
That's a good question. I'd say right off the top of my head, an organization that exemplifies a mature model has all of those qualities that Phil and I have talked about through the duration of this presentation. You've got your buy-in, you've got C-level champions, right? The board, if you're a publicly traded company or not, needs to buy in as well. So assuming all those things are in, right? That's the first step. Then you need the buy-in of your organization. You need to have the people and the places and the technology decisions that are being made. You need to have that guild, that center of excellence. And I think if you can get to that point where you're actually having regular meetings, you're pretty much beyond step 0 to step 1. I mean, if you're a really old school CMMI, sort of aware person, level 5 is the ultimate nirvana. And at that level, you have got automated infrastructure end to end, maybe not 100%, because I don't believe anything can be 100%. It just is the very nature of things. But at least you're 99, 95% there, where you have automated everything. You have a very secure framework in place based off your policies, based off the automation work that you're doing. You have a regular operational cadence that ensures that those assets are protected regularly. And then on top of that, while you're doing that, the successful organizations that are managing their spend establish the automated reporting and the integration to some extent or another, depending on how risky you want to get, to where if you catch anomalies up front, you can take certain drastic actions. One of the things we implemented at a prior place where we debated endlessly was this concept called the kill switch. And I love this concept. It means anything that I don't approve getting into the cloud gets killed before it gets there. That's a level of maturity that most organizations I've seen have been very wary to implement, because it infers that your automation framework is rich and complex enough that it understands that if I'm gonna kill this thing, it's not gonna be that big of a deal, maybe, loosely speaking. So I think you have multiple KPIs that really get you there, but the first one is, if you can have open, transparent, honest conversations between your dev and engineering teams, between your C-level teams, your CTO and CIO meet with the CFO regularly and they're all aligned, I think you are on the right trajectory. And I would encourage you to keep going. And you may find that you're at level 5, but there's always level 6. There's always something new to do to make it better.
I think that's that continuous loop back,
Yes.
that loop back effort there. How do we make it better? How do we make it better? Continuous optimization. So
Yep.
Well said, Wes.
So we have another question that just came in from Mike. Mike would like to know, should my company standardize on a single cloud provider or split between multiples, AWS, Azure, GCP? High level pros and cons on each.
You want to take it, Wes? You want me to? Go ahead, Wes. You're excited to take that one.
Multi-cloud is one of my specialties. It's I get giddy because at the end of the day, I think you end up finding out that look, Amazon by far is so above most cloud providers, except that there are things that Google Cloud does better than Amazon, and there are things that Microsoft does better than both. And so my personal feeling on this is it's not a one size fits all. Like, you have to determine what is in your best interest. I will tell you, multi-cloud strategies, especially if you're dealing with standardization and tools, is going to be much more difficult. For example, if you're at AWS, you're probably using a lot of CloudFormation. You're probably looking at some of the newer things that they're doing, like their, I think it was the SDKs or the CDKs or whatever the current acronym is for how they're really maturing CloudFormation development and the various tools. But if you try to take that and apply it to another part of the cloud provider, it's not going to work, obviously. So then you start looking at common tools like Terraform. I mean to mention these out loud, but they're out there. Ansible, there's a bunch of them. Those can provide an abstraction layer, but at the end of the day, you're still going to run into the same issues. It's going to be based on how mature you are. I always like to say maybe get one mature and then focus on the other. Or in the cases of the last place I was at that we were working on this multi-cloud strategy, we actually had a really highly effective engineering organization that was able to do both AWS and GCP at the same time, albeit AWS was far larger, 10 times the amount of spend than Google. But there were things that we found that Google did even better than Amazon, which is always sort of funny. So there's not a one size fits all. I would definitely say base it off of what you think you can accomplish with the team that you have working with you. Understand your risks of what that means. And I would also say, lastly, invest in your security team. Invest in your security team. They're the ones that are going to be looking at everything and trying to protect you from making decisions that you may have not been aware of. So if you can get people that understand Google Cloud, understand Azure, understand AWS, and can work within that, your multi-cloud strategy becomes a lot more achievable.
And just I'll add one more thing to that, Wes, is make sure that you can report on your multi-cloud usage.
Yes.
So make sure you get the cloud governance there. Make sure your tagging methodology, your governance is applied across the board, across the framework, and make sure you have good insights into that spend across the environment so that you can apply the same principles from that cost management perspective across the board.
Absolutely.
So I think we have time for one more question, and Phil, I'll let you lead it off. I think it might be a great one to end on because I think everyone would like to know, how do you get the C-levels to agree with each other?
Ooh, great question. I think it's, as far as that one goes, it really starts with communication and collaboration. It starts with honesty and transparency. And the way I've worked with a couple clients so far, and this is real life experiences, we've worked with a client, we've come in there, how much is your cloud spend? And this is on initial discussions with the CIO and CFO at the table. Those are typically the two that come to the table to have the discussions with us. And what's interesting, first, the CIO go, I don't really know. It's somewhere around here. And then the CFO would go, well, we kind of have to pull that information. Now, as I'm presenting our cloud cost monitoring and optimization practice, I would have thought, basically you would hope that they'd have that insight, but the fact that they don't shows me how the two are not connected with the teams below in terms of what their delivery is of the solution. So as we come in there and we start doing our discovery, it's really saying, okay, this is how the practice works. And our stewardship is traditionally works. We have the meetings with the engineers, call it the DevOps teams, the IT teams, understanding what the environment looks like. That's typically a weekly meeting. And then monthly and quarterly, we're meeting and sharing that information and insight with the senior level, the C levels, if you will, as to what is going on within the environment. And the more they see, the more transparency they have, the more they understand the direction of the organization from a technical perspective. And I'll give you a few good examples here. It's DR. CFOs don't necessarily know the cost of DR. And all of a sudden you start looking at it from a cost perspective and saying, this is what my production environment looks like. And hey, this is what, and you could call DR, some people look at it as optimization opportunities, look at it as waste, but there's a cost to DR there. And you have to understand when you're making a commitment to put DR out there, what's your RPO and RTO, recovery point objective, recovery time objective. These are discussions that CFOs typically haven't had in the past because it's all been managed by just get it done. It's on-prem. We have a couple data centers. I know you manage DR for me. Well, the reality is now all of a sudden you're in the cloud and there's a cost to doing that. So it's once again, it goes back to that transparency, open, honest communication, collaboration. And I think that's really what drives bringing everyone to the table. I don't know if you have anything else, Wes.
I cannot say anything else. Perfect.
So we are right on time, which is great. Mike did have a great second follow-up question. It may be something you want to connect with offline just to give him a deeper answer, but he really wanted to know, he said that cloud providers claim they have tools that help optimize costs, but how robust are these and how should they look at a managed service plus an outside tool?
So I'll hit on that real quick because we've worked with a lot of DevOps people in terms of our practice and our discussions around this. And the reality is there are a number of tools out there. There's a reason there are tools outside of the providers. And so Microsoft, for example, they bought one cloud provider. They basically injected that and rebuilt their own tools and got rid of that. So there's a constant shift in mode and movement between all these providers. What I would recommend is stay away from the built-in cloud tools, because the way they say, and AWS is specific about this, and Google and AWS and Azure, is if you want deep dive analytics for any of their data metrics, develop this outside data lake, develop this outside data warehouse, and then develop this reporting solution on top of it. So unless you're going to build a practice internally, I would look at outside tools to meet your specific needs. Wes?
Yeah, I'm the same boat. I think you can get a certain way with things like Quick Start within AWS as an example. But the very rich development has happened in the last year and a half, and these tools that are out there today that immediately integrate, and you can actually start getting executive facing dashboards and really wonderful insights. If you would have asked me 2 years ago, we were scrambling to find it, and we were arguing whether we should build it versus buy it. So yeah, spot on, Phil.
Perfect.
All right, so that is all she wrote. Those were all the questions, and they were really great questions. So I'd like to thank everyone for submitting them. Thank you both for your time. I thought it was a really fascinating conversation. As I said, the attendees will have an opportunity to take an anonymous survey after this, and they'll also get a link in a follow-up email. And we would thank you and appreciate any feedback and input you have so that we can make sure each webinar is better and better.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And Wes, thank you so much for the time. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you, Phil. Pleasure to be here.
All right. Take care, everyone.